The candles in the great dining room at Rentham Park burned low on Christmas Eve, and Edwina sat at the far end of the table as she had sat at every dinner since her arrival in November, quiet and composed and precisely as invisible as the household required her to be. 40 candles. She had counted them once, ranged in silver along the cloth, and not one of them had been placed near enough to warm her. At the table's head, Lord Ashford watched the wine in his glass rather than the woman his mother was currently dismantling, and his face held the particular stillness of a man who had decided long before this evening that certain things were simply the cost of living. She had known what she was coming to. She had not known it would feel quite like this. 6 weeks earlier, Edwina had stood in the parlor of the Hartwell cottage while Mr. Reinge Potts, the creditor's solicitor, explained in the patient tone of a man who expected nothing but agreement that her father's debt of £4,000 had been called in, and that she had precisely a fortnight to resolve the matter or vacate the property. Her father was 11 days in the ground. The cottage was all that remained of a life her parents had built across 30 years, and it would pass to strangers before the month was out. She had not wept in front of Mr. Potts. She had thanked him for his clarity and seen him to the door, and stood in the narrow hallway afterward with her back against the wall, listening to the house settle around her in the November quiet, and understood that endurance was no longer sufficient. She needed a solution, and she had nothing with which to purchase one. Lord James Ashford arrived 4 days later with a proposal so precisely calibrated to her circumstances that she understood at once she was not the first woman he had considered. He was 30 years old in March, he explained, standing in that same parlor with his hat in his hands, and his father's will contained a legacy clause requiring him to be married before that birthday or forfeit the entailed proceeds of the Rentham Estate's northern farms to a distant cousin he neither liked nor respected. He had no interest in a true marriage. He had had one of those, and he did not speak of it with any word that named what it had cost him, but his jaw tightened in a way that said what his voice refused to. He required a wife in name before March 25th, which the lawyers called Lady Day, and she required £4,000, and the distance between the Hartwell cottage and Rentham Park was 11 miles, which was near enough to be convenient and far enough to be discreet. He would settle her father's debt. She would come to Rentham as his countess. By spring, by mutual consent, the arrangement would be dissolved, and she would have the cottage free and clear and a small annual income besides. She had asked him once whether he wished her to sign something. He had said the contract was verbal, and that he considered verbal contracts binding in all matters of consequence. She had accepted. The carriage that brought her to Rentham Park on a gray November morning was the finest she had ever ridden in, and she had spent the 11 miles watching the fields pass and reminding herself that comfort was not belonging, and that a house receiving you under contract was not the same thing as a house that was yours. Rentham Park appeared first as a shape against the low sky, then as a facade of pale stone with 12 windows across the first floor, and 2 wings extending rearward into grounds that had gone bare for winter. A housekeeper named Mrs. Fielding met her at the door with the careful warmth of a woman who had been instructed to be courteous without being welcoming. The distinction was precise, and Edwina felt it at once the way one feels a door standing open to the cold. Lady Dorothea was in the drawing-room, seated beside the fire, with the straightness of a woman whose posture had been load-bearing for 40 years. She was handsome in the way of old portraits, all fine bones and calibrated expression, and she had looked at Edwina with the particular attentiveness of someone completing an assessment they had already decided the outcome of. "Miss Hartwell," she said, not rising, "we are pleased you have arrived safely. I trust the roads were not too terrible." She paused with the precision of a woman who uses pauses as punctuation. "James will explain the household's arrangements. I should only add that we expect the matter to be resolved quietly and by Lady Day at the latest. Disruption would be unfortunate. That was the first time. A temporary arrangement," the dowager's tone said, as plainly as if she had used the words aloud. "A problem to be solved before spring. A debt settled, and a woman returned to her proper obscurity." The first dinner confirmed it. Edwina sat at the table's far end, while Lady Dorothea described to the assembled household, which included a visiting cousin and the estate's land agent, that the Countess's position was one of mutual convenience, and that any assumption of permanence would be premature. She smiled as she spoke. It was the smile of a woman who believed that honesty, properly deployed, was indistinguishable from courtesy. Edwina ate her soup and said nothing, and learned the dimensions of the cage she was occupying. If you are finding yourself moved already, please do stay close. This story is only beginning, and what comes next matters very much. The weeks that followed were a careful education in the social geometry of Wrentham Park. Edwina occupied the Countess's rooms because the marriage was legal and the rooms were hers by form, but she took her private meals alone and spent her mornings in the library, which was the one room in the house where no one seemed to require anything of her. The library was long and warm and smelled of beeswax and old leather, and it contained, she discovered gradually, evidence of a man who read seriously and widely and in at least 3 languages. She read in the mornings and walked the grounds in the early afternoons before the light failed, and she worked in the evenings at a small writing desk in her sitting room, attending to the household correspondence that Mrs. Ann Fielding left for her signature with an expression suggesting she expected the signature to be temporary. She met James at dinner each evening, and at no other time by intention. He was punctual and correct, and said the things required of a host without adding to them. His eyes were a shade of gray that changed in different lights, darker indoors and almost blue against the sky when she saw him from a window crossing the park, and he had the quality of a man who had set his face against certain kinds of hope so thoroughly that he had forgotten he was doing it. He asked her once whether the library was serving her adequately. She said it was. He nodded as if this confirmed something and excused himself, and she watched him go and felt the precise distance between them as a physical thing, the way one feels the temperature drop approaching a stone wall. The first cracks appeared in November's 3rd week, and Edwina was not present when they began. She had come down the east corridor on a Tuesday morning at 9:30, intending the library, and heard voices raised in the passage outside the servants' hall. She recognized Nora's voice first, because Nora was the young housemaid who had shown her to the linen closet on her first morning, and had done so with a directness that was nearly warmth, and Nora's voice was currently frightened in the way of someone being charged with something they did not do. The housekeeper was accusing her of breaking a set of porcelain that Edwina had, in fact herself displaced from the mantelpiece while reaching for a book and had replaced carelessly. The breakage was Edwina's own fault, not Nora's, and Nora was clearly too loyal or too young to say so. Edwina came around the corner and said so herself. Mrs. So. Fielding received this correction with an expression that suggested it cost her considerably to accept it from a woman she considered provisional. She accepted it nonetheless because Edwina was the Countess by law, and her word carried weight the housekeeper could not easily override without consequences. Nora looked at the floor and then at Edwina, and what her face held was so near to gratitude that it became in the cold corridor that morning a kind of testimony. What Edwina did not know, and would not know for several days, was that James had come around the other end of the corridor at the moment she spoke. He had heard every word. He stood in the passage long enough to hear the housekeeper's capitulation, and Edwina's quiet instruction that the incident be considered closed, and then he turned and went back the way he had come. The expression on his face was not visible to anyone in the east corridor, and so Edwina could not see it. She saw other things, though, in their incremental accumulation. She saw that her place at dinner moved over the course of a fortnight from the far end of the table to a position nearer the center, and that no one acknowledged the change. She saw that when the December cold came sharp across the park, a better shawl appeared folded over the chair, in the library without explanation or attribution. She saw that James, who had previously excused himself from the evening room within the half hour, began on certain evenings to remain, reading on one side of the fire while she read on the other, the silence between them shifting from formal to merely quiet. She did not permit herself to read any of it as intention. Her wound was older than Wrentham, older than her father's debt. And it said plainly, "You are not the kind of woman a man of this station would choose freely. You are the kind of woman circumstances have temporarily required." She believed this completely. James's wound was older than hers, and she learned the shape of it one evening in the library when December had come down fully over the park, and the fire needed banking against the cold outside. He had been standing before the bookshelves with his back to her for a long moment, longer than the act of selecting a book required, and when he turned, he said, with the flat precision of a man releasing a sentence he had carried too long, that she may have noticed the portrait in the east corridor was turned to face the wall. She had noticed. She had not inquired. He said that his first wife's name had been Eleanor, and that Eleanor had died 18 months ago in childbed at Wrentham, and that the child had not survived either, and that he had been in London at the time because he had believed she preferred her confinement private, and he had honored that preference. Longer required honoring because there was no longer anyone to hold it. He said all of this in the same measured tone, looking at a point above the mantelpiece rather than at her, and she sat in her chair beside the fire and understood that she was receiving something he had not given to anyone else in this house, something that had been carried in complete silence for 18 months, and that the weight of it was visible in every line of him. She said she was sorry for Eleanor. She said it simply and did not add anything to it because there was nothing to add that would not diminish what she meant. And James was quiet for a moment, and then said that Edwina was, he had noticed, very good at saying the exact necessary thing, and nothing beyond it. She did not answer that either, and the fire burned between them, and the library held them both in its warm grammar of books and candlelight, and something in the room had changed by the time she retired, some arrangement of the air that had been formal and was now merely close. It was 2 days after this that James began looking at her in rooms, when he believed she was not watching him. She was often watching him. She was merely watching from the corner of her attention, rather than directly the way one watches a fire in a grate, not to see the flames, but to feel their light. She saw him hesitate at the library doorway one morning, when she had her back to it, hesitate for a full 3 seconds before entering, as if preparing for something. She saw him answer a question of his mother's about the spring arrangements, with the first truly clipped sentence she had heard him use with the Dowager, cutting off Lady Dorothea mid-elaboration in a way that required no interpretation at all. She saw Nora notice these things and file them away in the particular private ledger that loyal servants keep, and she watched Nora watching her, and understood that in this house at least, she had an ally. December 15th brought Miss Cecily Vane to Wrentham Park for a fortnight's visit, and the household shifted on its axis like a ship taking on ballast on one side. Cecily was 23 years old, and had been polished by money and expectation into a surface so fine it reflected whatever was placed before it, and what Lady Dorothea placed before her were the rooms nearest James's study, the seat nearest James at table. Cecily, and the occasion of every evening gathering arranged around her particular abilities at the pianoforte. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had been told since girlhood that she was the correct choice for a man like James, and she had organized her considerable accomplishments around the certainty of that verdict. She looked at Edwina with the careful courtesy of someone who has already been told the other person is temporary. The second voicing of the label came at the card evening on December 18th. Lady Dorothea and Cecily sat together at the table by the window, and the Dowager, sorting her hand with the ease of long practice, said to the room at large that Wrentham was accustomed to proper management, and that a temporary arrangement, however graciously accepted on both sides, could not substitute for the settled order the estate deserved. She glanced at Edwina as she spoke, the glance brief and untroubled, the glance of a woman who considers a verdict already given. Cecily said nothing, but the nothing was very loud. 3 days later, Edwina crossed the corridor outside the east parlor, and heard Lady Dorothea's voice through the half-open door, speaking to someone she could not see, saying that the situation would resolve itself by Lady Day at the latest, and that James was too sensible a man to let a contractual misfortune become a permanent one, and that they should all simply be patient, because Miss Hartwell, whatever her qualities, had never been the correct choice for Wrentham, and everyone present knew it. The door was only half open. The someone inside the room was Cecily, and Edwina did not stop to hear the reply. She walked down the corridor and out the side door into the winter garden, and stood in the cold air until the flush in her face resolved itself into simple winter chill. And she told herself the truth that she had been telling herself since October. That she had come here under contract, that the contract had a named date, that Lady Day was March 25th, and that the cottage would be hers and clear, and that was what mattered. She stood there until the cold required her back inside, and she went back in and she dressed for Christmas Eve dinner, and she sat at her place at the long table with 40 candles burning in silver, and she was composed and quiet, and everything the evening required. Cecily sat at James's right hand. The placement had been Lady Dorothea's arrangement, and it was as deliberate as the candlesticks. James's face, as he looked down the table at Edwina, held something she could not name, a quality of attention that her wound translated automatically into polite concern for a guest who was not quite comfortable. She translated it correctly. She was certain. She had been translating it correctly all along. Lady Dorothea waited until the second removed to speak. She said, into a brief silence, that Christmas at Wrentham had always been a time for considering the estate's future, and that she trusted they all understood how much James's proper settlement meant to the park and its people. She said that Wrentham deserved continuity of the kind that endured, rather than the kind that simply tided one over a legal inconvenience. She looked at Edwina as she said it, with the direct, untroubled gaze of a woman who believed she was performing a service. The table was very still. Edwina set her fork down. She touched the linen napkin at her lap. She said, in a voice that she calibrated to carry no tremor at all, that she thanked Lady Dorothea for her thoughts, and excused herself, and she rose from the table with the precise composure of a woman who has practiced dignity in the face of things that ought to have broken her, and she walked out of the dining room without hurrying. Behind her she heard James say his mother's name, once, in a tone she did not stay to hear the continuation of. She went to the study, because it was the nearest room that locked, and she sat in the chair behind the great desk, and pressed her fingers against the wood until her hands were steady, and then she lifted her eyes and saw it. The document lay on the corner of the desk where it had evidently been placed by a solicitor's hand some days prior, neatly folded, with her name and James's written across the top in the formal hand of a legal copyist. The annulment agreement, its terms already drafted, waiting for both their signatures, the spring made administrative and final. She did not touch it for a long time. She sat in the lamplight and looked at it and felt the four walls of the arrangement she had entered settle around her with a completeness they had not possessed before, because before this moment she had understood them only as walls, and now she understood them also as a door. And the door was already open, and the estate called Wrentham Park, with its 40 candles, and its library, and its East Corridor portrait, and its fire, crackling in the room where she had sat beside James in the quiet, was already, by the document's logic, releasing her. She was not the correct choice for Wrentham. She picked up the pen at the desk's edge. She read the document carefully. Every clause, because she was careful that way, and because careful reading was the habit of a woman who had learned that what was written mattered more than what was said. Then she set the pen down. She took a fresh sheet of paper from the corner and wrote on it in her own hand, not a long letter, because long letters were not what the moment required. She wrote 5 sentences. She wrote that she understood the terms of the arrangement and wished James every freedom the document offered. She wrote that she did not consider his obligation to her unmet. She wrote that Wrentham deserved the proper settlement his mother intended for it. She wrote that she would be gone before the household was awake. She signed it with her Christian name only. She folded the paper and left it beside the annulment document, both unsigned by her hand, and went upstairs to begin packing what she had brought with her. It was Nora who found her at 5:30 in the gray Christmas morning, standing at the door of the Countess's room with a small trunk and the composed expression of a woman preparing to walk 11 miles through December frost if no conveyance could be arranged, and who took one look at the trunk and the expression and said in a voice that was not quite steady, "My lady, please, Let me find him first." Edwina said that there was nothing to find him for. Nora said, "He'll want to know." And there was a certainty in it that Edwina did not have the resources to argue with at 5:30 on Christmas morning. And she sat back down on the edge of the bed and waited. And the frost was silver at the window, and somewhere below her the house was still asleep. James read her 5 sentences, standing in the study doorway in his shirt, without his coat, holding the paper in both hands the way one holds something that has already done its damage. He read it twice. Then he set the paper down on the desk beside the annulment document, which he observed without touching. And he was still for a moment with both hands flat on the desk and his eyes on the middle distance. What moved in him then was not visible to anyone in the house, because no one was awake to see it except Nora, who stood in the corridor and saw his face change, the way stone changes when water has found the crack it has been seeking. And she was very wise about love for a girl of 19, and she stepped back from the doorway and let him go. He crossed the house to where Edwina was waiting. She heard his step on the stair and stood, because standing seemed correct, and he came through the door of the Countess's room without knocking, and stopped when he saw the trunk and the coat she had already put on, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled stillness she had catalogued across 6 weeks of evenings, but the other thing underneath it, the thing the stillness had been holding down. He said, "You wrote that Wrentham deserved the proper settlement my mother intended for it." She said that she had. He said, "I would like you to tell me what you believe Wrentham deserves. Not what my mother believes. Not what the document on the desk believes. What you believe." She was quiet for a moment, because honesty at 6 in the morning on Christmas Day in a house that had spent 6 weeks telling her she was temporary was a costly thing to offer, and she measured the cost, and then she paid it. She said she believed Wrentham deserved to be a home rather than an arrangement, and that a home required someone in it who cared for it, not from duty or convenience, but from the particular love that came from learning a place, slowly, its corridors and cold drafts and the way the library light moved in the afternoon. And that she had spent 6 weeks learning it, and had come to care for it in exactly that way, and that this was not a qualification for the position she had been contracted into, and she understood that, and she was not arguing for anything. She was simply answering his question. He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and then he said, very quietly, "Come downstairs." With a drawing room held the household at 11 o'clock on Christmas morning, with the particular uneasy festivity of people who were aware that the previous evening had not been concluded properly. The fire was high, and the room was warm, and Lady Dorothea was seated in her chair, with the posture of someone who considered the morning's primary business to be the restoration of order. Cecily sat at the piano stool without playing, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. 2 housemaids moved quietly with the tea things. The estate's land agent, Mr. Prane. Groom stood near the window with a cup he was not drinking from. The visiting cousin had taken a chair by the bookcase and was studying his shoes. James entered at the drawing-room door with Edwina behind him, and the quality of his entry was not the quality of a man fulfilling a social obligation. He crossed the room at the pace of a man who has decided something irrevocable and is now simply performing its consequences, and everyone in the room felt the difference immediately. Lady Dorothea's fan opened with a small snap. He stopped in the center of the room, where all of them could see him clearly, and he looked at his mother, and then at Cecily, and then he turned to Edwina, and the turn was deliberate and witnessed. He said, "I should like to introduce my wife, not a countess, not Miss Hartwell, not a temporary arrangement, his wife," with the simple directness of a man correcting a public record. The room was very still. The fire crackled, with the indifference of fire which knows nothing of social consequence. "Lady Dorothea," said James, with a particular inflection that meant many things and none of them were yielding, and James turned to his mother and looked at her for a moment with what Edwina could only have described, standing behind him, as patience that had run out. He said, "The annulment document is on the study desk, unsigned. I will have it returned to the solicitor, with instructions to destroy it." If you would like to discuss my decisions regarding this house, I am available to you this afternoon." It was not a long speech, it was not a loud speech. It was the speech of a man who had spent 18 months carrying the accumulated weight of what he believed he had failed at, and who had recognized, at 5:30 on a Christmas morning, standing over a letter written by a woman who released him from every obligation, before asking for anything in return, that the thing he was most afraid of was not the wound he carried, but the further diminishment of letting it close every door. Lady Dorothea's fan was still in her hand, not moving. Something passed across her face, a complex rearrangement of the confidence she had organized her winter around, and then she looked at Edwina with an attention that was different from any she had given her before, the attention of a woman revising an assessment in real time. And Edwina met her gaze with the steady composure she had carried through 6 weeks of being told she was insufficient, and the dowager looked away first. Cecily sat at the piano stool with her hands still folded, and the certainty she had arrived with, which had been polished so fine it had seemed impenetrable, showed, in this moment, its edge. He rose quietly, because she understood what she had witnessed, and she was gracious enough to understand it without requiring it to be explained to her, and she excused herself from the room with a correctness that was its own kind of dignity. Mr. Groom returned to studying the window. The housemaids had stopped moving. The visiting cousin had given up on his shoes. Nora stood in the doorway with a tray she was not delivering, holding it with both hands, and the expression of someone witnessing a thing they will describe for the rest of their life. James turned from his mother to Edwina, and what was in his face now was the thing she had been translating incorrectly for 6 weeks, the thing her wound had reliably converted into polite concern or contractual obligation or the natural courtesy of a decent man. She was reading it without the wound's interference for the first time, and it was considerably more than courtesy. He said her name. Her Christian name, Edwina, not Miss Hartwell, not my lady, not the careful forms of address by which the house had kept its distance from her. She said, "The cottage is 11 miles. He said, "I know exactly how far it is," with something in his voice that might, in a man less careful, have been almost amusement. She said, "Your mother will require some persuasion." He said, "My mother requires less than she believes." She has been revising her opinion for the last 4 minutes, and will arrive at the correct conclusion before supper. Lady Dorothea, still in her chair by the fire, said nothing to this, which was itself a kind of concession from a woman who had something to say about almost everything. And Edwina felt, for the first time since the carriage had brought her 11 miles through November gray, that the walls of the arrangement she had entered were not walls at all, but simply the first rooms of a house she had not yet fully explored. The drawing-room settled into the particular warmth of a Christmas morning that has completed its primary business and does not require any further ceremony. There is a moment in some houses where the year turns and the house seems to breathe differently, and Wrentham Park had that moment on Christmas evening when the last guests had removed themselves from the drawing-room and the fire had been built high against the deep cold of the night, and the snow that had been threatening since morning finally arrived at the windows in the small, sifting way of a snow that intends to stay. Edwina sat in the chair beside the fire that had become across 6 weeks of evenings. Her chair, and James sat across from her as he had sat across from her on a dozen evenings in the library, and the silence between them was neither formal nor merely quiet, but a third thing that had no name yet, but that she thought might acquire one in time. Nora brought the tea in at 9 o'clock, and lingered over the arrangement of it by the hearth, longer than the task required. And Edwina looked up and found her face, and what was on it was the open, unguarded warmth of a girl who was very pleased with the day's proceedings, and Edwina thanked her for the tea, and for a great deal else besides. And Nora ducked her head and went out. The snow was thickening at the windows. The fire shifted and resettled. James rose once and crossed to the east wall where the portrait of Eleanor hung face to face with the plaster, and he stood before it for a long moment. Edwina watched him from her chair. He put one hand to the portrait's frame and turned it, slowly, until Eleanor's face was forward, looking into the room. It was a serious face, gentle around the eyes, and Edwina regarded it with the respect one pays to someone's real sorrow. And James came back to his chair and sat down and did not speak of it, and she did not require him to. What she understood was this: a man who turns a portrait back to the wall is punishing himself with an absence. A man who turns it forward has decided that remembering is not the same as refusing to live. He had made that decision tonight, in this room, with the snow at the windows and the fire between them, and she was not the cause of it so much as the occasion, and she was content with that. The house around them was very quiet. Mrs. Cratter Fielding had retired. The land agent had gone back to his own cottage. The visiting cousin had taken to his room with a novel. Lady Dorothea had said good night to both of them with a formality that held within it, Edwina thought, the first careful grammar of a revision. The way a sentence that has been wrong for a long time begins, slowly, to correct itself. James said without preamble that he had been given to understand by the estate's solicitor that the Hartwell cottage could be transferred clear of debt into his wife's name at any time, and that he had intended to do this at Lady Day as part of the annulment terms, and that he was of the opinion that waiting until Lady Day was no longer necessary or desirable. Edwina said the cottage could wait. He said it could, but that he preferred she have it regardless, as a thing that was simply hers, belonging to her in the way that things should belong to people, freely and without condition. And he said this with the flat directness of a man who has realized that the particular mistake he is most afraid of repeating is the mistake of not saying the necessary thing while there is still time to say it. She looked at him across the fire for a moment and said that she had spent 6 weeks learning this house and that she had no particular wish to leave it. He said good, and the word was short and level and carried everything that his careful grammar had withheld across 6 weeks of evenings, and she heard it fully. The snow fell outside the long windows of Wrentham Park. The fire burned steadily in the grate. Somewhere above them the house lay in its winter quiet, 11 miles from the cottage that had been her whole world 3 months ago, and Eleanor looked out from her portrait with the serious gentleness of someone who has been remembered correctly at last. Nora would tell the story of Christmas morning for years, with a particular pride of someone who played a small necessary part, and Lady Dorothea would arrive at her revision by supper on Boxing Day and express it in the way of women who have been wrong in large matters, by being very right about small ones. And Cecily would return to London with the fortnight shortened by 4 days, and would make an excellent match the following spring with a viscount who suited her considerably better than a grieving earl had ever been going to. These things were not yet known in the Christmas evening firelight. What was known was the snow and the fire and the house, breathing around 2 people who had come to it under the terms of a contract and had discovered, in the careful daily accumulation of ordinary moments, something the contract had not anticipated and could not have named. Edwina looked at Eleanor's portrait once more, and then at the fire, and then at James, who was watching her with the open, steady attention he had been practicing across 6 weeks of evenings, and which she was only now learning to receive. Without translation, Wrentham Park held them both in its winter grammar. The snow fell and kept falling. The candle on the mantelpiece burned down to its last bright inch, and then held the way some lights do, steady against the dark long past the hour when they might reasonably have gone out. She was home. If Edwina's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. These stories exist because you watch them, and that matters very much.